Out of all the pieces of conspiracy evidence, one of the earliest hoax arguments is the lack of stars in photographs. Looking through thousands and thousands of widely published photographs, this became one of Bill Kaysing's primary arguments.
In your book you mentioned that there were no stars in the photos that NASA took.
That's right, and they had the most marvelous opportunity to take pictures of all the stars in the universe visible from the moon. I've talked to a number of top-level astronauts, both locally and elsewhere, and they say that the astronauts would have been overwhelmed by the sight of trillions of stars, not to mention Jupiter and Saturn and the other planets and so forth, but not one picture has ever come back from the alleged trip to the moon showing the stars in all their magnificence, nor do any of the astronauts comment on the stars. They completely ignore it. It would be like going to Niagara Falls and talking about the hamburger you ate.
Of course, there is a simple reason why the stars appear absent in these photographs. Photography is all about letting light into the camera's iris and allow it to fall on photographic film. Put simply, the more light the object is reflecting or emitting, the more exposed it will be, whereas comparatively dimmer objects will not turn up on film very well. To photograph dimmer objects, the camera's shutter must be left open longer to allow enough dim light to register on film, but subsequently, this allows the brighter objects to come out white and overexposed. It is for this reason why stars are absent in photographs supposedly taken on the moon. But that is not to say that they couldn't have been taken.
Doesn't NASA say that the reason that there were no stars is because their cameras weren't set for the proper exposure? Isn't that their line?
That's their line, and that's pure baloney, because I've talked to photographic experts who say that NASA had all the money in the world to have a camera that would have taken magnificent pictures of stars.
Hi folks, this is Jarrah White here. I'm at the Killian Observatory, so give you a bit of a tour I suppose. During a visit to the Killian Observatory, I accidentally proved Bill Kaysing correct. My tour of the observatory was filmed using my Panasonic NV-GS35 camera. With its lens zoomed all the way out, it has an angle of view near identical to that of the Hasselblad still camera. I must stress that my camera was set for daylight conditions. But, by tilting it up from the surface and pointing it away from any lights, my camera was able to capture Alpha Centauri. See if I can photograph the stars under these circumstances.
Okay, let's have a look at some of the stars now. The brightest and the second brightest star in the night sky have set. So we're going to start with number 3. And the third brightest star in the sky is quite famous for a number of reasons. And that's a star called Alpha Centauri. And it doesn't have any other name, it's just called Alpha Centauri. And actually, no, it's not. It's also called Rigel Centaurus. Yes, Rigel Centaurus. Basically, that means the leg of the centaur. And it is that bright star up there.
Yep.
So if you just go from those green spots, now you have 2. You've got 2.
I can photograph it!
Yeah, the point of the arrow.
Those 2. Those 2 are the pointers to the Southern Cross. You've got the cross over there, and they are the pointers. In the legends of the...
Well, to be exact, Alpha Centauri is actually 3 stars close together. But my point is, even with a fast exposure, under good conditions, the brightest stars will still register on film. Only the dimmer ones will be absent. Now, suppose I was outside the Earth's atmosphere and photographing them with a longer exposure setting. The camera on Apollo was an upgraded 500 EL model, known as the Hasselblad EDC. On his website, Robert Brainig has this to say regarding its ability to photograph stars.
The Apollo photos are of brightly lit objects on the surface of the moon, for which fast exposure settings were required. The fast exposure simply did not allow enough starlight into the camera to record an image on the film. For the same reason, images of the Earth taken from orbit also lack stars. The stars are there, they just don't appear in the pictures. The hoax advocates often argue that stars should be visible, and some of their claims are valid. However, they fail to recognize the difference between seeing stars and photographing stars. The astronauts could have recorded star images in their photos by increasing exposures, but they were not there to take star pictures. The purpose of the photos was to record the astronauts' activities on the surface of the moon.
Did anyone else hear what Robert A. Brannig just said?
The astronauts could have recorded star images in their photos by increasing exposures.
Under the circumstances, what they were and were not there to do is irrelevant. It would be like going to Manhattan to do a documentary about the New York City firefighters when all of a sudden a big plane flies overhead and smashes into a nearby building. Do you continue shooting your documentary, or do you focus on the collision? Given that the Hasselblad could indeed have been set for star photography, then why, on the Zigzag Productions documentary, The Truth Behind the Moon Landings, did Jay Windley tell us,
"We're going to find out that if we use an identical camera loaded with identical film, and we shoot pictures of the night sky, we won't get stars."
This statement is in direct contradiction to what Robert Brannig states on his website.
The astronauts could have recorded star images in their photos by increasing exposures.
If we use an identical camera loaded with identical film, and we shoot pictures of the night sky, we won't get stars.
If they could indeed have been used to take photos of stars, why were we not told so on that documentary? Years later, when I brought these contradictory statements to attention, Windley quickly backpedaled at the Bad Astronomy forums.
I do not say that the Apollo cameras had no proper exposure setting, simply that the cameras were never set to them, and for good reason.
He also contacted me directly, telling me,
"You have constantly and maliciously misinterpreted my statements made on my website and in the television program you saw, over whose editing I had absolutely no control. There was no need to make clear to viewers of the program that the still cameras could be set appropriately to photograph stars, because the inference that I claimed they could not is yours alone."
this is in direct contradiction of what he told me a year earlier at the Apollo Hoax Yahoo group on September 30th, 2005, when I stated, "I know for a fact that the cameras could easily be set properly to take star pictures." He responded,
No, they couldn't.
on his website, Windley states that taking star photos using these cameras would have required an exposure setting as long as 30 seconds. Yet, in response to Bill Casing, Brannig displays this space shuttle photo clearly showing stars, which he claims was recorded using a 4-second exposure. Elsewhere in his website, Windley displays this image of a shuttle firing its RCS thrusters. He claims that this photo used a long exposure to capture the RCS plume and the stars in the background. If that's the case, why is the shuttle exposed correctly? It is quite easy to prove that a long exposure would not have been required to record this photograph. The following video clip was extracted from the ABC documentary Surviving Extremes.
In the 1990s, the Americans had no equivalent to Mir, so they began sending astronauts to the space station to work alongside their Russian colleagues. Andy Thomas was to be the last of them.
The crew did some thruster firings to catch up with the Mir space station, which was way, way ahead of us. It appeared in the distance initially as a very small point of light. And as we drew closer, it grew larger and larger. And eventually you could see the solar panels and you could make it out as a space station.